It is my pleasure to introduce Keith Dayton to you. Keith Dayton was initiated into Pilot Defy while at the College of William and Mary. Upon graduating, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Army, where he would go on to serve for 40 years before retiring at the rank of Lieutenant General. For those of you who are outside of the military, that means he had 3 stars. His final Army assignment was a U.S. security coordinator to Israel and the Palestinian Authority in Jerusalem. A foreign area officer by training, General Dayton studied at the U.S. Army Russian Institute in Garmisch. His assignments in that field included politico-military staff officer for the Army in Washington, D.C., U.S. Defense Attaché in Russia, and Deputy Director for Politico-Military Affairs, Europe, and Africa. General Dayton also worked as Director for Operations and Director for Human Intelligence for the Defense Intelligence Agency in Washington, D.C., including duty as Director of the Iraqi Survey Group for Operation Iraqi Freedom. And he went on to direct the Strategy, Plans, and Policy Division for the Department of the Army before his final assignment to Jerusalem. His military awards include the Defense Distinguished Service Medal with 2 oak leaf clusters, the Army Distinguished Service Medal with oak leaf cluster, the Defense Superior Service Medal, and the Legion of Merit with an oak leaf cluster. After his time in the Army, he served as the director for the George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies. The Marshall Center is a German-American security partnership that has produced generations of global security professionals schooled in American and German security policies. The mission of the Marshall Center is to enable solutions to regional and transnational security challenges through capacity building, access, and a globally connected network. He was responsible for orchestrating resident courses, outreach programs, and an international and interagency network of about 14,000 government officials from 156 nations in fields of international security studies, defense, and foreign affairs. In November of 2018, Secretary of Defense James Mattis appointed General Dayton as the senior U.S. defense advisor to Ukraine. General Dayton's extensive leadership experience, his broad and substantial engagement in and knowledge of European affairs, and his demonstrated ability to manage complex and sensitive policy issues made him an often sought expert when it came to relations with Ukraine. General Dayton has a Bachelor of Arts degree in history from William and Mary, a master's degree in history from Cambridge University, and a master's degree in international relations from the University of Southern California. Additionally, he earned a senior service college fellowship to Harvard University, and he served as the senior Army Fellow on the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. Please welcome General Dayton to the stage.
Well, thank you, Ian. I'm going to talk from up here because I'm not a politician. I always marvel at what Senator Cardin is able to do, okay, or any U.S. politician. They can come down here and talk to you for 30 or 45 minutes on any topic, and they do it very well, and they do it very coherently. I'm not going to do that because I'm a military guy. We tend to do things a bit more structured, and so I've actually got some remarks. Ian asked me to talk about leadership, okay? Well, that's a topic that's a mile wide and an inch deep. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to rely on an example of leadership, not a pie lamb, but I'm going to rely on that in my prepared remarks. But before I do that, let me just give you a little story, because I find out that sometimes when you give a story, people remember that as opposed to what you said in your speech.
Colonel, could you speak into the mic, please?
I thought I was. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Okay, I'll move over here. I'm going to close the laptop because I got to put my notes here. Anyway, here's the story. It was told to me at the Marshall Center, and there are many variants of this story, but I like this one, by an Italian officer who was there about the Carabinieri, okay? Now, most of you, some of you anyway, probably know that the Carabinieri is like a national police force in Italy, okay? They perform functions of riot control, crowd control. They even do traffic stops and things like that, okay? They're all over the country, very highly regarded by the Italians. And the story goes something like this, that there was a man about my age who had saved up all his life to buy a really fast car, okay? And he bought himself a Maserati, a convertible, and he's really feeling good. And so one day he decides he's going to take it out on the Italian autostrada, which is like, you know, interstate highway, and see how the car performs. So he really dresses for the part. You know, he puts on a scarf around his neck. He puts on one of these flat caps on his head, top down, drives out onto the autostrada, and he sees what the car can do. And before he knows it, the car is doing about 70 miles an hour. The speed limit on the autostrada is 70 miles an hour. He's saying, well, this is nothing. This car's not even being tested yet. So then he gets up to 80 and 90 and 100. And he's feeling really good. But then what he didn't see was a Carabinieri trooper at a rest area that he just passed in a Fiat watching him breaking the law. So the Carabinieri guy says, I got to stop this guy. He's a reckless driver. He's doing 100 miles an hour. And he pulls out behind him, turns on the flashing lights, and the guy sees him in the rearview mirror and says, a Fiat? What's the problem here? I can outrace this guy. And before he knows it, he's doing 120 miles an hour. But the Fiat stays with him. And he, aside from the fact he couldn't believe it, he says, this isn't who I am. I am a law-abiding guy. I'm going to go ahead and pull over and take my punishment as I should. So he pulls over. The Fiat pulls up behind him. The Carabinieri trooper gets out of his vehicle. He walks over, looks down at the guy, and he says, do you know what you were doing? And he says, yeah, I was speeding, and I was speeding pretty badly. And the Carabinieri trooper says, you know, it's the end of my shift. And I really don't want to have to go through all the nonsense of writing up a ticket and then appearing in court with you and having to go through all the bureaucratic nonsense that we have to go through. If you can give me a convincing explanation why you accelerated when you saw me pull in behind you, I'll let you off with a warning. The moral of the story, by the way, is keep your sense of humor and you might get out of a bad spot. The guy sits there and thinks for a minute, and he looks up and very seriously says to the Carabinieri trooper, well, you see, it's like this. 3 months ago, my wife ran away with a Carabinieri trooper, and I thought you were bringing her back. That one you can tell your families. So, well, look, thank you for this opportunity to provide some remarks on leadership in this annual convention. A few words up front about myself. You already heard Ian, but I'm going to repeat some of it because it also helps fill the time that I'm trying to fill here. But I was a brother in the Virginia Psi chapter of Pi Lam at the College of William and Mary, and what I learned there about brotherhood and integrity have been with me all my life. I encourage you to study the creed a little bit if you haven't already done so, and see what it means. And you will have a foundation for good leadership. While you're here, think seriously about the concept in the creed of servant leadership, okay? And being part of something larger than yourself. A few of my brothers, kind of sitting in the back there, have done me the honor of being here today. Some of them I haven't seen for 52 years. If you get a chance to talk to them, do so, because they are true leaders. And their presence here speaks volumes about what Pi Lam is all about and what brotherhood really means. Now, I graduated from William & Mary in 1970. Most of you weren't born yet. Some of your parents weren't even born yet. And I immediately went into the Army as an artillery officer. 51 years later, I'd had enough. In May of last year, to be precise. But what a learning experience it gave me along the way. and a lot of exposure to leaders and leadership. And truthfully, in many ways, that's what you're all about, or at least that's what you should be all about. I did retire in 2010 as a lieutenant general. Never thought I'd make it that far, after more than 40 years in the Army. And I was an artilleryman, and as you heard later, a foreign area officer for the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. Interesting. I had command experience all the way up to brigade level, which is about 3,000 people that worked for me. But they didn't really work for me. They worked for subordinate leaders, and that's an important thing to remember, and I'll come back to that. I had assignments that took me from Korea to Russia to Germany 3 times, Iraq, where, as you heard, I led the Iraq Survey Group. What's that? Well, it looked for the weapons of mass destruction. Okay? I spent 15 months in that country and went everywhere. And you know at least the public story about it. I can tell you some private things later if you're interested about WMD and my own personal views. But let's put it this way, the public story is, in my view, not exactly what really happened. Anyway, my last Army assignment was 5 years, as you heard, as the U.S. Security Coordinator for Israel and the Palestinian Authority in Jerusalem, where, believe it or not, when I was at William and Mary, Highland was renowned for being the only fraternity on campus that would take Jewish members. And if you don't think that came back to me in spades when I lived 5 years in Israel by myself, without my family, well, it certainly did. And they became my second family. As you heard again, after retirement, I was appointed the director of the Marshall Center in Germany, where I spent the next 10 and a half years. Now, that's where I'm coming to, because General Marshall was one of the greatest Americans of the 20th century. And my remarks are going to focus on his leadership philosophy with a little bit of history thrown in. A few words first about the Marshall Center. As Ian said, it is a German-American partnership. It has security officials and military officers from all over the world. And it's been in existence since 1993. The number of alumni is now up to 17,000, and many of them are defense ministers and generals and even a couple of presidents that have attended there. Named, of course, in the honor of George Marshall, and outside of our headquarters, we have a statue of him on a bridge, basically going from Europe to America. He was dedicated to the idea that nations can learn from each other for a more secure future. Now, I feel a little bit presumptuous talking about leadership among some of you very seasoned leaders and also some of you young leaders here, since I'm in the company, as I said, of brothers from my pledge class who probably are better leaders than I ever will be. I had a U.S. Senator come here in front of me. He's a great leader too. There's no doubt about it. Nevertheless, I do have a message for you, and I'm going to do my best to convey it. And that message is about what George Catlin Marshall had to say about leadership and how he lived it throughout his life. Marshall was a career Army officer, okay? Everybody out here know who Marshall was? Anybody not know who Marshall was? I don't know how good our history education is these days. Anyway, he spent most of his time in the small peacetime army of the United States. He served as an aide to General Pershing after the First World War. But his true fame came as America's involvement with World War II deepened. He is often called the architect of victory in World War II. He didn't command any armies in the field because President Roosevelt considered him to be too important and too valuable to the war effort to let him leave Washington. And in many ways, he was the essential military person whose leadership allowed the Allied victory in World War II. Think about the task that faced him. He inherited a small peacetime army of a couple of 100,000 people that had been neglected during the 1920s and 1930s. Through his leadership and organizing skills, he transformed that military into a victorious group of 7 million, well-trained, well-equipped, and well-led. He not only organized the armed forces, but he organized the defense industry as well. And without George Marshall's inspired leadership, it's hard to imagine America having won a two-front war. After promotion to 5-star general, we don't have any of those these days, General of the Armies it's called, and orchestrating the American Allied victory in World War II, he can fairly be said to have invented the peace. President Truman appointed him Secretary of State in 1947, where he served for 2 years, and most significantly was the Marshall Plan. I hope you've heard of that. Believe me, I spent a lot of my time in Europe, and even today, technically it's called the European Recovery Act of 1948, but even today, Germans would come up to me and say, he saved our country from absolute disaster by this plan. And many people think we might have to have a Marshall Plan again, especially after the war in Ukraine. He was successful in establishing a prosperous, modern Europe. Well, it's no surprise that he was Time Magazine's Man of the Year in 1943 and 1947. And leadership and vision often go together to complement each other. There's an old biblical phrase which I've always liked. It comes out of Proverbs. When the leader has no vision, the people perish. Think about that for a minute, okay? And that applies to some of us old timers, but a lot of you youngsters, because you're going to be in these leadership positions better again. He then went on to be Secretary of Defense. He won the Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, in 1953, mainly for the Marshall Plan and things that he did thereafter. He's the only military man to ever receive the Nobel Peace Prize. So what was the key to his success? Well, in my view, it's leadership. And so I'm going to tell you basically things about him. And he had 7 principles that I'm going to share with you. You know, he was a young aide to an Army Major General in World War I, and the Army gives you an evaluation. You know how you're doing every year. And in the evaluation, this general said, I should be following Marshall, him not following me. This guy was known to be a leader very early on. His subordinates talked about quiet self-confidence, a lack of flamboyance, and an ability to make those who worked for him do it because they didn't want to disappoint him, not because they were ordered to do so. Some call it charisma. I would call it leadership. He even went off to my part of the world. I'm from the state of Washington, and he commanded some civilian conservation corps people out there in the 1930s out of a place called Fort Vancouver, where they did all this work in Oregon and Southwest Washington, and the civilians thought that he was the most inspiring leader they had ever met. So what did he say about selfless service and leadership? Because those two interrelated qualities guided his life. And frankly, I think guide this fraternity. Some quotes of his. I hope they provide guideposts for you youngsters out here as you set out on your futures. 1, he said, keep your wits about you and your eyes open. Keep on working hard. Sooner or later, the opportunity will present itself. You heard Senator Cardin say this, by the way. And then you must be prepared temperamentally to profit by it. Leaders are not quitters, and you can't sit back and wait for something to happen to you, okay? Leaders take advantage of an opportunity when it shows up, and they're ready for it because they've been thinking about it all along. Second quote I like, don't fight the problem, decide it. Now, that sounds pretty easy to understand, but most people don't do that. Marshall was a man who deeply valued advice from his colleagues. He often said, don't ask me what to do, tell me what I should do, okay? That's not what you usually hear about generals. Usually it's the other way around. But he was renowned for this. And this way, all points of view were included in the discussions that he had and the decisions that emerged. But in the end, he was decisive. I think Marshall would stand here and say Hamlet would have been a very bad leader. Third quote, when a thing is done, it's done. Don't look back, look forward to your next challenge. How many times have we known people that continue to second guess and worry about the decisions that they make? Don't do that. If one is always looking back and second guessing, the focus isn't on what comes next because something is coming next. Events move too quickly to waste your time on that. No one follows a hesitant leader. In fact, the term hesitant leader is an oxymoron. Fourth, he said, passive inactivity because you have not been given specific instructions to do this or do that is a serious problem. Absolutely, because then the problem catches you and you don't catch the problem. It's always easy to sit back and wait further instructions or to say somebody else will decide that and I'll implement it. That's not what leaders do. A leader needs to know what is right and to do it. And the result is that others will follow and action has to follow conviction. The fifth one is kind of old-fashioned talk, but it actually has a good point. He said, go straight down the road, do what is best, and do it frankly without evasion. Well, that embodies the essence of leadership. First of all, you need to do what's best. And you decide that. No one else is going to decide that for you. Integrity, transparency, honesty in everything we do. Go straight down the road. It's so easy to take a side turn and weasel word your way out of something. Marshall would have said, no, that's not the way you do this. The Pi Lam Creed touches on this, believe it or not, in its simple emphasis on devotion to the highest standards of honesty and justice. Again, if you haven't read the Creed and you can't recite it by heart, and it's not that long, you need to do that. Because then the words will come back to you over and over again. The leader owes these qualities to those people that he or she leads. And make no mistake, those whom you attempt to lead can smell a phony miles away, and they won't follow. As an old soldier myself, I can appreciate the sixth quote that I like, even though it doesn't relate directly to leadership. Marshall believed deeply that the only way human beings can prevent war is to prevent it. Think about that for a minute. That is about as true as it gets. And this is from a general who led the United States military in World War II. True leaders don't sacrifice their people in pursuit of a goal that can be achieved by other means. You aren't going to be in positions more than likely where you're going to sacrifice people, but you may sacrifice other things. If you're going to sacrifice something, make sure it's worth it, because a true leader can sense that and won't do it if it doesn't achieve a higher goal. And now my favorite, and this is the final quote I'm going to give you. And these are truly words, in my view, for a leader to live by. Marshall said, the most important factor of leadership is character, which involves integrity, unselfish and devoted purpose, a sturdiness of bearing when everything goes wrong and all are critical, and a willingness to sacrifice self in the interest of the common good. I'm going to repeat that a little bit later because I'm almost done. But think about that. Character. Character is an individual thing. Each one of you out here owns your own character. And it's up to you to make sure that the people that are going to follow you understand that you are a person of character, that you embody the principles of honesty, integrity, and devotion in what you're doing. And then you can be a good leader. To me, the character matters above all else. And it's not a coincidence that character is one of the values of this particular fraternity. Anyone can be put in a leadership position, but only a person with true character can lead. Well, let me conclude here. You're here for an annual convention of one of the most valued and principled organizations you're going to find anywhere, especially at your level. The Pi Lam Creed and values were actually very important to me. When I went to William and Mary, I had no idea I would join a fraternity, and there were many of them there. But Pi Lam was the one that emphasized equality, commitment, and character, with a little bit of scholarship thrown in as well. And that is what attracted me to this particular organization. And as I stand here 52 years later, I can tell you it still attracts me. It's very important. Now, many of you are going to find yourselves as leaders. Some people will tell you leaders are boring, they're not educated. General Marshall would see that very differently. He would suggest to you there maybe are 5 leadership principles that you ought to keep in mind that he learned and practiced throughout his life. The first one is selflessness. Okay? The opposite of how most of us are motivated. For a successful leader, service has to come first, before and in place of self-interest. Always. Second would be candor. A leader has to be forthright and speak honestly. The leader is always on display. Don't ever forget that. Even you folks that are here representing your colleges, you're on display. People are watching what you do. And when you go back, they'll be watching what you do. Sorry about that, but it's one of the costs of leadership. And you need to be mindful that people will be listening to what you have to say. The third principle that Marshall would emphasize, and I think all of you would agree with, is integrity. As leaders, your word must be your bond. If you lose a reputation for integrity, you cannot be a leader. No one will trust you. And a leader who is not trusted will fail. Fourth principle, commitment. All of us know what's right. It's in our DNA. Small children know what's right, okay? When you do something wrong, you know it's wrong. And you kind of feel a little bit guilty about it, but commitment is going to be a key here. The challenge is to do what's right, and then do it in a way that inspires others to do the same. And finally, Marshall lived the principle of courage. I'm not talking courage on the battlefield, okay? That is often a thing that happens on the spur of the moment. The person that commits courage on the battlefield, of course, has it already inside them, but they demonstrate it usually on the spur of the moment. But what Marshall would say in courage is that it's the moral courage to do the right thing even when others criticize you from the sidelines. This can be more difficult than physical courage, but it's a key attribute of a successful leader. I encourage all of you to cultivate the moral courage to stay on the path in your heart that you know is the right one, regardless of the many obstacles you're going to find along the way. Leadership isn't fun. Matter of fact, it's extremely challenging. It may be the hardest thing you ever have to do, but you're in it. And I think all of you will be leaders, and this will become your leader. And let me commend to you one other thing, leadership technique that Marshall perfected during his long and storied career, and that is the delegation of authority, but not responsibility. Let me say that again. Delegate authority, but not the responsibility. Marshall was famous for saying, if it goes very well, they did it. If it goes okay, we did it. But if it goes badly, I did it. The leader has to take responsibility for the actions of those he leads, while giving them credit for their success and taking it on the chin for failure. And guess what? There will be failures. When I was a young lieutenant, only a couple of years out of William and Mary, I came across a leadership pamphlet that the Army was circulating at the time. And in it, there was an old Asian proverb that I remember to this day. And I tried to use it as a guide to my efforts at leadership over the years. And it goes like this. The truly great leader is one whose presence is hardly known. When the work is done, his people will say they did it themselves. Think about that. When the work is done, his people will say they did it themselves. All of you young leaders should strive for that. When the work in front of you is done, whatever it is, those whom you lead should be able to say they did it themselves. In closing, for the young Pilants in the audience, I wish you all great success in your years ahead. Remember that your parents, your families and friends, your brothers, help make you who you are and help you get to where you are. Never forget that. Let me finally repeat the words of George Marshall as I close. The most important factor of leadership is character, which involves integrity, unselfish and devoted purpose, a sturdiness of bearing when everything goes wrong and all are critical, and a willingness to sacrifice self in the interest of the common good. May God be with you on your forward journeys, and I believe if George Marshall was here today, he'd be smiling on this group. I know I certainly am. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Keith, for those fantastic remarks and very, very relevant remarks for our students. We have some questions for you. Thinking back to your time at William and Mary, how did you find a way to balance all of your ROTC commitments, the other organizations you were part of, and your time in the fraternity?
Probably poorly, but nevertheless, look, the fraternity was a place of refuge, if I can put it. That sounds kind of silly. But it was a place you could come to where all those other responsibilities didn't matter. We're talking to some of my brothers last night, and one of the things that our fraternity did, and I suspect most of yours do as well, our chapter did, was to have a session once a week where the brothers could air their grievances at each other, okay? Health and welfare, I forget what we called it. What was it called, Herb?
Good and welfare.
Good and welfare, okay? And boy, I'll tell you what, if that didn't create bonds, I don't know what did. At William and Mary, we had the opportunity after the first year that I was there to actually have a fraternity house where we all lived. It was not Animal House, although some tried to make it that way. But nevertheless, it was a place where you could go and you could actually be yourself. Look, William and Mary, in the time I went to school there, it was a small, sleepy southern town. We actually had a fraternity that prided itself on its Confederate heritage, and they would parade in Confederate uniforms and Confederate flags. Highland was very, very different. Yeah, we had good times on weekends. You heard Senator Cardin say the same thing. But during the weeks, it was business. I mean, it was studying. Our fraternity had a lot of the leadership positions in the college, and our fraternity even had Phi Beta Kappa people, okay? Which is not the standard view you get of fraternities these days. So I would tell you that Highland became a true home while away at school, and I think that's what it ought to be. And again, the testimony to me is I got a table back there populated with folks that I haven't seen in over 5 decades. And they came here, and I'm very grateful. Okay?
In addition to your remarks, are there any other parts of PILAM that you feel really prepared you for your military career?
Okay, I'm going to embarrass him. I won't mention his name, but one of our brothers last night was kind of answering this question around the table, and he got to the creed, and he, look, I mean, we're grown men, we're in our 70s, and he choked up. It's very fashionable these days to think things like the creed and values and say, these are just old-fashioned ideas. No, they're not. They may have been around for a long time, but they really mean something. And this fraternity, and again, all I have is William and Mary's experience, but at William and Mary, this was the one that lived this, okay? They lived the words of that creed at a time when many others did not. And, again, Williamsburg, Virginia, a sleepy, small southern town, and here you have a fraternity that is dedicated to equality, to inclusion, to diversity, to you name it. Wow. I mean, I don't see how anybody could have passed up pledging this particular fraternity. And I would tell you that that is probably its greatest strength. And don't lose it for me, guys, okay? We've been keeping this in our hearts for 50 years. It's up to you to keep it going. Please do.
Thinking about the values you've talked about just there and before, any additional thoughts on how your values have really shaped and influenced the policy decisions you've put out in your military and post-military career?
I'll go back to the comment on character. Look, integrity, if I had to rank all the values, integrity is the one you can deal with. It's the one that is your personal responsibility. And if you give up on your integrity, it is, first of all, you're going to feel bad about it later. But secondly, nobody is going to follow you, okay? Be honest to yourself and be honest to others. And I've tried to follow that all my life. Look, I'm not any great shakes. I mean, all right, I got to be a senior general in the Army, so what? But I found out in dealing in my last assignment in Israel and in Palestine that that's something that the Israelis treasure above all. is honesty and integrity. And if you can convince them that you have those qualities, they will do anything for you. It's one of the reasons why our Palestinian friends are having difficulty, because they've not established that reputation yet. But I tell you what, working with the Israeli Defense Forces very closely as I did, man, you can do anything if you have integrity and honesty. And I guess I'd leave it at that, okay? By the way, one thing I didn't tell you, Senator Cardin, I should have confronted him. And if you have, I don't know if we've got time, but I can move on to other topics if you want. I was nominated by President Trump to be our ambassador to Ukraine, okay? Unfortunately, he did it very late in the administration. He didn't want a State Department person because he viewed he had a bad experience with that. So he wanted a non-partisan, non-State Department person. And somehow my name came up, mainly because I was the defense advisor already. And so I can talk to you about Ukraine till the cows come home if you're interested in that. I have very strong views. Some of them you won't like, but nevertheless, I go back to you, Ian, sorry.
No problem. Well, for all of us, we're all aware broadly of what's going on, some more than others. I guess I would ask, based on that topic, what do you feel in all of your expertise, working with, studying, interacting with Ukraine, what should we know about that situation, and what should we most care about?
It's a much harder question than you might think. I gave a talk on Ukraine before the Russians invaded. And my talk was, make sure you understand what this country really is, okay? Ukraine is a deeply corrupt country. There's no doubt about it. There's a group called, I forget, Integrity International or something like that, that ranks countries in the world on a sort of corruption index. And out of 150 countries, and number one is the best, which is Denmark of all countries, by the way. Ukraine was about 120, okay? Behind Russia, hard to believe, and well behind the United States, even though some of us think our country is increasingly corrupt as well. So understand who it is. Secondly, understand it's a deeply divided country. In many ways, although it's the largest country in Europe besides Russia, its history, there was no Ukraine until the end of the Second World War, okay? Part of it was Poland, part of it belonged to Russian Empire or the Soviet Union, okay? It was not a country. So they've been working very hard to try to create a country out of this. The problem is the country is deeply divided. The western side of the country is, some would say, basically Polish background, okay? Western-oriented, looking towards the west. And the eastern side, where most of the fighting's been done, looks to the east, looks to Russia. The people speak Russian, that's their first language. People in the west speak Ukrainian as their first language. And Ukrainian, by the way, is a mix of Polish and Russian, big surprise there. The third part of Ukraine is Crimea. And Crimea was always part of Russia until 1953, when it was given to the Soviet Socialist Republic of Ukraine as a gift by a guy named Nikita Khrushchev to commemorate the 300th anniversary of a Cossack chief who had done an alliance with the Tsar in Moscow, or in St. Petersburg. Anyway, make a long story short, it's a deeply divided country, and so when we look at it, it's not an easy equation to solve, okay? Make it worse by the invasion of Russia, okay? There's no doubt about it. There's one victim in this war, and that's Ukraine. There's one perpetrator in this war, and that's Russia. And it's a totally unjustified war, okay? I, for one, found it so unjustified that I didn't even think it would happen. I thought at the last minute there'd be some kind of compromise. Didn't happen. And what the Russians have done in the last 5 months is they have occupied a strip of territory that runs from the Russian border along the Black Sea all the way to Crimea. It used to be Ukrainian territory. And if you think they're going to give it back, think again, okay? We provide a huge amount of weapons. We provide a lot of money. We have all kinds of things to Ukraine because they desperately need it. But it's not going to change that fact, in my view. I think we're in a We're basically in a war of attrition and a stalemate, and the sooner, I believe, that our country tries to organize some kind of peace talks and we'll solve this problem next year type thing, the better. Because Ukrainian civilians, look, the Russians are barbarians. They don't give a crap about people dying. There are a lot of Russians dying. Okay, we understand that, but a lot of Ukrainians are dying every day. And for what? This is not a conflict that is going to be resolved anytime soon. But Ukraine itself is a deeply troubled country, and even if the shooting stops, don't expect things to change very quickly. It's just a very sad situation in Europe in the 21st century. Who would have thought?
Thank you for sharing that with us. You mentioned, of course, earlier about your time leading the Iraqi survey group. And so the question is, how did you navigate leading that when the entire country and the world were watching that unfold?
Well, first thing was I had top cover, okay? And some of you may not like President George Bush, but President George Bush is the one that asked me to go do this, okay? And it was an international group. We had a lot of Australians, we had New Zealanders, we had British, and we had Canadians that also worked with us. So there's top cover internationally there as well. I was asked last night if I'm ever going to write anything on this, and I probably will. I've been waiting till I retired. But, you know, the story is pretty simple, and that is, well, there was no weapons of mass destruction. It was a big scam. It was an excuse by the administration to invade Iraq. Not quite so fast. I was the head of the human intelligence aspect of the Defense Intelligence Agency when I got told to go to Iraq and lead this group. We had a lot of intelligence information. And you can say, well, it was all bogus. No, I don't think so. We had locations that we went and looked at, okay, that were identified as places where they were either making weapons of mass destruction or they were being stored. Every single place we went to, you could see there had been a building there, but the building was gone. Even to the floor tiles, they were gone, okay? Remember, we gave the Iraqis about 30 days warning that we were coming. And during those 30 days, we also had satellite photos that showed convoys stacked up at the border with Syria in the northern part of Iraq that were like miles long every single day. And so we found some of the drivers of these trucks and said, what were you carrying? And these were basically peasants, and they said, we have no idea. We were just, you know, the army came and they said, okay, we're going to put some stuff, you're going to tractor trailer here, you're going to take these things into Iraq, we're going to give you a gas mask and we're going to give you rubber gloves, you take it about 10 miles into Syria, you drop off your trailer and go home. Makes you kind of wonder, doesn't it? My personal view is that a lot of stuff was moved out of Iraq. I can't prove it, and this is where I go back to George Bush. He visited our headquarters, actually, in Iraq. And we briefed him, and he said, this is all very, very intriguing. And he says, you know, I'm getting beaten up all over the place in the United States right now over the fact that, you know, Bush lied and people died. That was kind of the phrase that was being done then. And he said, I would dearly love to share this information with people, but unless you could prove it in a court of law, I don't want to do that. And we couldn't prove it in a court of law. It's just circumstantial evidence, a lot of it. But someday, maybe I'll have a chance to put the record straighter a little bit. Who knows? But that's the leadership challenge, was getting all of these countries to work together because it was a highly political thing. And then getting the Iraqis to agree as well, which was hard to do.
Thank you for sharing all of that context to that part of our history. Switching gears with just a few final questions. When you think back to your time at William & Mary within Pi Lambda Phi, any other standout, favorite, fun memories?
I should yield to the table in the back is what I should really do. Look, and you heard it from Senator Cardin. Fraternities are also social clubs. Okay, there's no doubt about it. One of my brothers is fond of saying that he watched Animal House 3 times, and it wasn't until the end of the third one that he realized it was a documentary on our fraternity. We had a good time, okay? On weekends especially. Senator Cardin's smarter than I am. He wasn't going to go there, okay? He just said basically if a lot of this stuff came out, I wouldn't be here right now. But nevertheless, it was all done with a real strong sense that we're all in this together. I'd never been in an organization before where everybody felt they were part of it and they were a contributing part, and what they had to say mattered and what they did mattered. And that's my memory of William and Mary, was that again, in a pretty dog-eat-dog world out there, there was a place you could go, you could basically relax, you could do some stupid things, which we did, but at the end of the day, you weren't going to be criticized by your brothers because they were your brothers in the strongest sense of that word. And they would stick with you no matter what. And again, I'll tell you, I was blown away when Ian told me there were some guys coming from the Virginia Psi chapter of William and Mary, which hasn't been active now for 20 or some years, that they showed up here, okay? And some of them came long distances from Texas, I think Las Vegas. I mean, my gosh. And of course, the ones in the local area. So anyway.
Final question for you. If you could go back in time and give advice to a younger version of Keith in college, 19 or 20 years old, what would that advice be?
Get more dates. This isn't as funny as you think. I mean, we had a real spectrum of people in Virginia Psi chapter. And I kind of got the reputation as the guy that never had a date, okay? Because I was kind of a shy person and, it just didn't kind of work out well. But some of my pledge brothers were very good at getting dates. And I used to just sit in awe of them. So I would recommend get a date or two, and that would be a good idea.
Thank you so much, General Dayton, for your remarks and your time with us. One more round of snaps for Brother Dayton.